Good evening, everyone. I am Will Fenton, the Director of Research and Public Programs at the Library Company of Philadelphia. I see a bunch of regulars, but just in case we have some new folks finding their way into the fold, the Library Company is an independent research library. We were originally founded by Benjamin Franklin in 1731, and we've grown a good deal over the past 300 odd years. Today we have terrific programs in women's history, African-American history, business, and commercial history, and of course, visual culture. We have a whole program devoted to visual culture, which is the occasion for tonight's special edition of our Fireside Chat series. Now, before I pass it over to our much more capable MC tonight, I just wanted to give a couple of quick notes about housekeeping here. You'll notice that there's just 4 of us on screen, well, 3 of us actually, and that is by design. Your camera is not enabled at 7 o'clock on a Thursday. We're going to be kind to you and let you have a little bit of a reprieve from the panopticon that is Zoom. And that being said, you can still participate. This is a Zoom webinar, meaning that you can comment through the chat functionality, but in particular, there are 2 overlapping dialogue buttons at the bottom of your screen. That's where you can enter your questions. So as you're listening to what promises to be a fantastic, illuminating talk, you can pose your questions as soon as you come up with them, and our MC of the evening will bring your questions to the fold. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce Erica Piola. She is our Curator of Graphic Arts and the Director of the Visual Culture Program. Welcome, Erica.
Thanks, Will. I really appreciate it. And as Will said, yeah, please feel free to type questions in the Q&A. That's probably gonna be a little bit easier for me than the chat, but I can try and work both of them. But yeah, Q&A, go for that. So again, good evening and thank you, Will. And as Will said, I'm Erica Director. I'm Erica Piola. I'm the Curator of Graphic Arts and the Director of the Visual Culture Program. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's Fireside Chat. Before I introduce our speaker, Bob Frishman, if you will so indulge me, I wanted to just quickly introduce the Visual Culture Program to those unfamiliar with it. Started over a decade ago to foster the study and creative use of historic visual material for the study of the past, the program seeks to facilitate programs, exhibitions, and projects that confront, explore, and complicate the social construction of what we see, how we see it, and why we see it as we do. Tonight, we explore the visual culture of mechanical timekeeping through several centuries of documentary, metaphorical, and symbolic representations of timepieces in fine art. And we will watch time go by with our speaker, horology scholar, Bob Frishman. Mr. Frishman, founder of Bell Time Clocks for Repair and Sales, has studied horology for over 4 decades. He has written more than 100 articles and reviews, as well as has widely lectured about the subject. He has also organized several related conferences, including at Winterthur, the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, and the Museum of the American Revolution. He is also a fellow of the National Association of Watch and Clock Collectors, a freeman of the Worshipful Company of Clockmakers London, England, and holds Library Company Share number 8, which was first held by Joseph Stretch, son of prominent early American clockmaker Peter Stretch. Presently, Mr. Frishman is researching and writing a book about colonial Philadelphia clockmaker Edward Duffield. And I also just wanted to mention that Bob did say that he does have a title list of the images that he's showing tonight. So if anyone's interested, that is something we can we'll send out with the recording, or it sounded like Bob was also, if you wanted to get in contact with him, he could send you individual images as well. So please keep that in mind. And in wasting no further time, I turn over the screen to Mr. Bob Frishman.
Great, thank you. Let's see if we do this right. You should see my picture coming up. There, looks good to me. I hope everyone else is seeing this as well. And certainly thank you Library Company and my fine friends there for inviting me here. I'm happy to be a shareholder and to have one of those early great shares that actually has a horological connection. So I appreciate that too. Tonight, you're going to see some fine art images with clocks in them. I actually have 2,011 of them now in my database. I'm not going to show you all of them. I'll probably stop at around 2007. Don't worry, it will be fewer than that, I promise. But I love preparing these talks because it allows me to actually go through them again and pick out ones that are maybe more appealing to me now than they were before, vice versa, or ones that particularly relate to the particular audience. So that's a kind of bonus for me too, to do these talks. So I'm happy to do it. Of course, every image I could spend half an hour on, but we're going to go through them quickly. And as Erica said, I'm happy to share the list, to share individual images with anybody that wants to. And at the end, I'll show up my website address and other things that'll help you find me if you'd like to. So if we move along here, because this is Fireside, not Firesign, some of you may remember that humorous theater, but this is a Fireside chat. So I've got a couple that begin with this too that I love to show, and are certainly among my horology and art favorites anyway. This is, and in each case too, my list will have the year, but I'm not going to keep repeating the year. But mostly it's a chronological list, as you would imagine from a clock guy. But we go back and forth a little bit. This is George Caleb Bingham, and it's family life on the frontier. So you see that there's a nice OG clock on the mantle, and here is a family out on the American frontier, and they're by the fireside. There's I have one more fireside image too. This is the African-American artist Henry Osawa Tanner. And you see that they're again at the fireside. In some cases, you have to look a little bit. It isn't quite the spot the clock kind of game where they're tiny. But in this case, you know, if you look over here, you'll see a tall case clock in this family's family room, I guess, or living room with the spinning wheel and all in play. So often when I mention horology and art, people, especially if they're in the art world, they think, oh, he's talking about those awful tourist grade 19th century paintings, mostly from Germany, where there's actually a little actual clock built into the painting. And that this is an example of one of those. And that clock originally, and maybe in the future, actually works and tells time. But trust me, this is not what I'm talking about. Most of these paintings are junky and you wouldn't want to own one unless you wanted a painting with a real clock in it. So that's not the subject of my talk. I show the library company because my original intent, and perhaps I'll be invited back for round two, is that I was going to come and comb through the prints, the thousands of prints and visual images that you have there, that Erica oversees along with others there, and find many more examples of horology and art from the library company's own collection. Obviously, in the last year, I wasn't able to do that, and they weren't willing to ship me their entire print collection for me to go through. So there'll be some Philadelphia-related things here, but I hope to mine the collection there, and perhaps again show you some more horology and art things that are actually in the library collection, library company collection. Often when I give this talk, I see people starting to get antsy. They say, oh my God, does he know about Dali? You know, what about that Dali one? I sure hope he hasn't forgotten about that. So right off the bat, I'm telling you that, yes, I know about his melting clocks, and I know of the story behind them. Apparently, he had painted the background here first, which was near his home in Spain. And he had a horrible migraine headache, and which was worsened even by him eating some old brie cheese at dinner. But he toughed it out, he soldiered on, he went back into his studio, and perhaps as a result of this migraine, got the idea of having melting clocks, and that's the origin of this painting. Apparently down here too, maybe all of you already spotted this, is a self-portrait of Salvatore Dali. So now you know more about this painting than perhaps you wanted to. The main thing about it is, as I was talking about with Erica before, we often don't know or forget about the scale of these paintings. So I'm here showing you the actual size of this painting that's in the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. Again, I thought, oh boy, I'm going to have a real experience looking at this painting, and here it is, kind of the size of a Cheerios box. So it's still powerful, of course, but in this case, I think maybe a full screen image conveys the power more than this small image does. I'm showing the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston because, as Erica mentioned in passing too, I created and hosted a horology and art symposium in 2017 at the Museum of Fine Art, where I had many eminent scholars come and talk about various aspects of it. And at the end, you'll see a website which I've kept live for that symposium, where actually you can cycle back and watch video recordings of all my speakers. My keynoter was John Wilmerding, who some of you may recognize that name. He's one of the most eminent American art historians in America. He ran the National Gallery of Art for some decades in Washington, D.C. So it was a wonderful coup to get him. I stumbled on him essentially because he wrote this book. So when I'm poking around 5 years ago, I guess, trying to see who would be good speakers, and I looked for things that had clock in the title, up pops John Wilmerding's book. And from there, he got it. He knew what I was after. He didn't talk about clocks as far as, how they work and that kind of thing. He talked about time in American 19th century paintings, depictions of time, and that was perfect and wonderful. And of course, he did a great job. But what you're going to have now is really a whirlwind tour of art history, again, 7 years. So we'll be ripping through centuries of art, and we're covering all kinds of iconic and mostly well-known artists who have pictured timepieces. So you'll, again, if it's fast, feel free to get back to me and I can share images, tell you more as we go along. We're back here in the 4th century. This is actually a Roman mosaic showing a sundial. This is a columnar sundial. And as I've been told, this inscription actually means I'm late for lunch. And we realized that even back then, people were starting to object to the tyranny of timekeepers and how you couldn't eat when you were hungry, you couldn't sleep when the sun went down, you were sort of married to these newfangled timekeeping devices which began to rule your life. And of course, that's something we all suffer from now, but it's not a new phenomenon, apparently. So if we go into early Renaissance times, here you see a depiction of an early iron frame clock. This is 15th century. And there was an early feeling that mechanical clocks were metaphors or depictions of God, the clockmaker, God, the watchmaker, because he essentially created the universe under this theme in the same way that clockmakers create clocks, where they put something together, they put all the parts together, and then they give it a push and it's off and it has a life of its own. So this is, as you see, a very, certainly a theological painting of a heavenly figure who's setting perhaps the universe, but in this case, setting this clock in motion. So we're now looking at Botticelli. This is a fresco of his. This is of St. Augustine from the 3rd or 4th century. And of course, this is a atavistic kind of, anachronistic kind of painting, because certainly there were no mechanical clocks at that time. They didn't come about for another 1,000 years, perhaps, but we're seeing them here. And fortunately, this fresco came to the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, not at the time of my symposium, but afterwards. So I was able to see this in real life. And this, again, gives you a sense of the size and perhaps power of that image as well. Leonardo Da Vinci, I look for all these iconic names and pray that I'll find something with a clock or watch in it. The Mona Lisa, unless it's a clock or watch is hidden under her clothing, I found no other Leonardo da Vinci depictions of clocks except this in his notes. You see his renowned mirror writing that was, I guess, supposed to discourage some people from reading it or copying it. But this is a depiction of an early timekeeping device. So I do have a Da Vinci, even though it's not a beautiful oil painting. This is one of my early favorites too. This is Titian, and this is the Duchess of Urbino. She took over from her husband, the Duke of Urbino, of course, a province in Italy, when he was exiled for being on the wrong side of an argument. But you see her lands in the background here, and you see her faithful little spaniel here with its eye cocked open. But I'm sure everyone realizes these types of portraits and oil paintings were not selfies or snapped with a cell phone. They were composed, and the sitter and the artist decided very carefully what the composition was going to be and what was going to be in it. So you see, of course, she's very fashionably, luxuriously dressed, but she selected among the few props to have a small German, South German clock. And that is Again, it's not in there by accident. It doesn't say that, you know, one happened to be there by accident. This is demonstrating that she was modern, affluent, cultured, and disciplined as well. She kind of was ruling the place by the hour and attentive to the passage of time. This shows someone at the other end of the social spectrum, I suppose. This is probably a servant or even an enslaved African who was in Italy, and here she is holding probably the affluent family's clock, demonstrating that they had not only an exotic servant, but they had an exotic, early, expensive timekeeper as well. This was one of my early finds. It came up at an auction in Christie's. It went off to a dealer, and it was at that time attributed to Annibale Carracci, a well-known Renaissance painter. And this is actually only half the portrait. There was another person better dressed next to her, which another little version of this shows part of her, but that's gone. But this painting is now in Abu Dhabi, in the Louvre Satellite Museum in Abu Dhabi, no longer attributed to Carracci. So I'm not sure what the backstory is there, but it's still kind of an interesting painting, not only of a clock, but of a social situation at the time. And in a few instances, I'll actually show similar examples of the clock so you get a better idea of what you're looking at. So again, these were South German, North Italy, perhaps. Very expensive, not particularly reliable. And as you notice here too, clocks in that period had one hand and one hand only. If you think about it, you don't really need two hands. If this hand is pointing between the 4 and the 5, you can pretty much tell that it's about 20 minutes to 5. So you can keep an eye on that and notice when you see early paintings. And in shops like this, and this is a depiction of a German Renaissance era clockmaking shop, are the kinds of venues where clocks like this would have been produced. In this case, you can see that if this is the clockmaker being depicted, he's very well dressed, as lace collar, fancy clothing and all, indicating, as in most cases, that clockmakers were at the top or near the top of the order of artisans and craftsmen. They had to be extremely well educated in lengthy apprenticeships. They had to be skillful, knowledgeable about astronomy, about metallurgy, other things like that. So they were not shoemakers. They were substantially up the ladder from that in many ways. This man may be a watchmaker. This is Peter Paul Rubens, but I'm guessing instead that this was just demonstrating that he owned this. Perhaps this is a wedding picture too, or something like that, where he's holding a pocket watch. But in this case, by Franz Hals, we're much more convinced that this is a watchmaker. And some of the provenance indications of this painting, we think it's a Dutch watchmaker from that period. So here he's both showing off the fact that he has a watch and perhaps indicating what his trade is as well. So as we move along, certainly also in Holland, there was a whole tradition of these Vanitas paintings, which were as clear metaphors, symbolic paintings as you can get, reminding everybody that time flies. You have only a certain amount of time on earth here to be good, to not only enjoy life, but to do good and be the kind of person you should be, so that you will be rewarded in the next life. And very often a watch is laying there on the table, as about as clear an image as you could want of time's passage and mortality. And of course, these watches are wonderful for us too, because these for us watch and clock collectors, because they are often very finely painted depictions of early timepieces. In this case, you can see that this is actually a montre à tact, to use the French, meaning that you could tell the time by feeling these little raised dots and the hand that's there as well. So you wouldn't have to see the time. So either if you were blind or visually impaired, perhaps, or just trying to feel the time if you didn't have enough light, this is a great example of one of those. This is another one of these Vanitas paintings, showing again the turned over glass, which you don't need to be Freud to figure out what some of this imagery is about. But again, we have a lovely watch here. This is actually a striking watch, because you can see the inside of the lid here is actually a bell. So this watch would make little ding ding sounds as well. The fun thing I love about this painting is you actually see the artist reflected in this glass globe on the side. So that's a wonderful little addition as well. Some of these are not quite as alarming in their messages. This is just pretty flowers, which are to make you feel like life is worth enjoying. But you see, again, we have a watch here, which I think is again reminding you, perhaps in a more gentle way, that that time is passing and you need to enjoy it well. This symbolism too. This is kind of a Spanish version of one of those reminders of time's passing. In this case, it's called the Knight's Dream, and you see he's dreaming, and these are the things he's dreaming about. And these again are all of life's vanities. You have an angel here with an inscription again reminding him that he's young now and healthy, but he won't be forever. And here's how he'll end up with the skull. Again, all kinds of symbolism here. Money, you know, that won't do you any good in the afterlife. And of course, this little lovely little again Southern Augsburg or Nuremberg clock, probably dead center in the painting, so you know that it was an important part of the composition. And again, I'll show you one of those. These are called little, even miniature tower or turret clocks, because they are kind of miniature representations of the kinds of tower clocks that were starting to proliferate through Europe. Communities that could afford to have a tower clock loudly announcing the time all over the city had reached a certain level of affluence. And now that they could kind of recreate them in a small scale for domestic and personal ownership, that even extended the concept a bit further. So there's a whole genre of women with watches, again, showing their sophistication. This is Rembrandt. So I was very fortunate to find an example of Rembrandt's artistry with a young woman with a fan here who's holding a watch. In fact, the title of the painting is A Young Woman with Fan. I don't know why it's not Young Woman with Watch, but I guess they decided that that was the title that was preferable. There's one other fascinating Rembrandt that I love. So this is a grisaille, which is the preliminary drawing for what was going to be a dry point etching. So in this case, this is Ecce Homo. This is Christ before Pilate, a depiction of Christ in Jerusalem. And although this is an image that looks a lot like the clock in Venice underneath this arch, and you see that there's a clock face here. Again, another interesting time warp, because there were no mechanical clocks at that time. So maybe during the intervening time after he did this preliminary drawing and produced the etching, you see the same scene again in reverse, because it's an etching, but the clock is gone. So perhaps somebody said, Rem, you know, they didn't have clocks back then. Oh God, you're right. And he didn't put it in the final product. So that's a fun thing. So we're back in a Dutch painting now. This is Jan Stein, and he does these wonderful depictions of kind of dissolute households in Amsterdam and other places in Holland. And these were very popular among more austere Dutch people who would hang these paintings to kind of say, yeah, look at them, you know, luckily we're not like them. They're having a ball, but, you know, they're all going to hell and they're going to have hangovers the next day, if nothing worse. But they love these kind of paintings for that reason. And they're full of all kinds of imagery of the overturned things, and you know, people doing things they shouldn't be, dogs eating the meal, that kind of thing, the jewelry. And often there's a clock on the wall, and you see in this case the little monkey, which is a symbol that everyone would have recognized then for lust, is here playing with the wall clock. So got another French painting with a big beautiful figural clock here, but this is telling the story because this was also often a flirtation device where he's offering to help her adjust her garter. And anyone seeing this painting would have understood that that's the situation here. This is a little calmer Dutch scene, but this is a marriage negotiation. You see the nice Dutch clock on the wall, but these gentlemen, probably this is the groom or perhaps this being interrogated, but you see the prospective bride is eavesdropping in the doorway there to see how the negotiations were going. She's smiling, so it looks like things are probably going okay for her. This is Hogarth, and this also tells more of a story. Again, I'm glancing over at my notes occasionally because I sometimes mix her name up. This is Miss Mary Edwards, and you see she has a watch hanging here. Again, you're playing spot the clock a little bit. She also has her faithful dog like the Duchess of Urbino, but she has a watch hanging here. Mary Edwards was a rich woman of the time who began campaigning against what was happening, in that rich commoners essentially were being married off to dissolute, impoverished noble people, so that the commoner family could get a noble title. And she was very much against that. It was a bad system for many reasons, including as part of a series that Hogarth did on the subject, because what would often happen, here's the wife, this is shortly after the marriage, and here's the dissolute nobleman who's just returned from a night out trysting, probably with prostitutes. You know, he's got I think underwear hanging out of his pocket over here, and he's just come back. And the problem, it wasn't simply that he was being unfaithful or blowing all of the money that she brought to the marriage, but he often would bring syphilis to the marriage. And it ended up usually costing the life eventually of the wife as well. So this was a very serious issue, which Hogarth assisted in publicizing and hopefully helping to correct, along with Mary Edwards, who we saw previously. A little less morbid Hogarth painting is this one of the Graham family. You see a bracket clock over here to the side, and a typical trope too of the Grim Reaper sitting on top of it. This is a fun painting for a lot of reasons. You know, they all look innocent, but you can see there's a story going on here, and this cat is looking like it's hungrily eyeing the bird in the cage. So again, more's happening here. But one thing I like about this is that you can see he's cranking this little Serenette. And when I was in Colonial Williamsburg a few years ago, I actually saw one of these, and I realized what it was and read the label and realized even more. These were instruments which you would crank, and they would play tunes in order to teach the caged bird those melodies. So the boy was actually playing this, trying to get the bird to sing the same melody that would come out of this selection of tunes in this Serenette. So I'm not dealing a lot with prints. I'm trying to stick with actual fine art. But again, when you have somebody like George Cruikshank, I have probably a couple of dozen of Cruikshank prints that have clocks in them in some way. And this is a satirical view of sort of the ongoing antagonism between England and France, where you have a John Bull kind of character here, disputing perhaps with the Frenchman on that side, and a lovely wall clock in the background. Always the nice sort of roast beef English people, and perhaps the leaner Frenchman off to the side. This, of course, is a more familiar Frenchman, a portrait of Napoleon, lovely high quality regulator, perhaps by a clockmaker named Janvier in the background. But again, we're telling a story here. This is Napoleon late at night. You see the candle almost burnt down here. He's hard at work for the people of France. He's already dressed in his uniform to go review the troops the next morning. He's got Plutarch around. He's got some of the Napoleonic code here that he's working on. And interestingly enough, this painting was commissioned by a Scottish nobleman. You may think Scotland, England, they all hated Napoleon. Not true. Scots were still remembering the days when they weren't part of England. And there was a lot of Scottish good feeling towards Napoleon, and this painting was commissioned by a Scotch nobleman to hang in his place, maybe because he was hoping maybe someday Scotland would achieve its independence again, which is a subject that again has come along. We're going to zip to Philadelphia for a moment here, because this has sometimes been called the earliest oil painting in America. Circa 1705. This is a painting by Christopher Witt, and we know Christopher Witt also as a clockmaker, but he also was a painter, and he joined Johannes Kelpius, who was a kind of a German mystic who brought a bunch of German followers here, and they lived in caves out along the Schuylkill River. And this is a portrait painted of Kelpius. soon after he came, when Christopher Witt joined him from Germany. There's an interesting clock on the wall here. We're not quite sure what it is, but I think it probably is a type of lantern clock. And I'm showing this because if you go to my website, I authored 36 of these horology and art articles, features, each one about a particular artwork, and some of the ones that I'm telling you about tonight. But in this case, I did this whole page about this artwork, so you could find it again on my website, and you'll see that link at the end. But what it could be a depiction of is a lantern clock that was a distinctive type of lantern clock, which has these wings on the side, because these often had a very wide swing of the pendulum that was mounted in the back. So if you wanted to enclose that pendulum so it wasn't out in the air, perhaps in danger of having a cat grab it or something, it could be enclosed in these wings. So perhaps that's what Christopher Witt was depicting in kind of a primitive way. Of course, there's these few other great scenes of Philadelphia. This is one of the birch views from around 1800. And as you know, this giant tall case clock is still attached to the side of the State House. It wasn't for a while, but it got restored back on there. So we see a view of it here. This was actually one end of a double-ended clock. There was a face on the other end of the building as well, but in this case, the movement was in the middle. Long drive shaft would turn the hands on this side. And she mentioned my forthcoming book on Edward Duffield, the colonial Philadelphia clockmaker. For about a decade, he was in charge of maintaining the State House clock, so he would have been fussing with that occasionally as well. And this great criminal depiction from a few years later, showing Election Day in Philadelphia. I haven't been to Philadelphia on Election Day. Perhaps it still looks the same as this, but you can see again that we've caught a view of this clock face here. As you can see, there was formerly a building attached, these two buildings, so that part of that had to be removed to accommodate it, but the clock face is still there. We're looking at some, again, American paintings now, some sort of bordering on folk art. This perhaps is getting to be that category. This is a Robert Peckham painting, and this is a painting of his family. The name of this painting that's at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts is the Peckham Sawyer family. He married into that family. This is a view of their parlor in Bolton, Massachusetts. You see a tall clock standing in the corner. And again, this was no accident, quick shot with a cell phone. This was a composed scene indicating that this family was sophisticated, affluent enough to have a tall case clock standing in the corner. What we're also seeing, as you might think at first, is a party. But you see the shades are, the shutters are closed. People are looking kind of somber because this is actually a post-mortem family portrait, because this little girl here, Elizabeth, had died about 3 months before this painting was created. And this was kind of a memorial to her. And this was not uncommon, that there were posthumous paintings done to show that the person was still part of the family, even though they were deceased. So it's a sad image, but I think for them, it was still a reminder when infant mortality, child mortality was so high, that little Elizabeth was still part of the family. I don't believe this is a post-mortem, but this is another Robert Peckham scene. I always love with this type of painting where the perspective, the dimensions are a little bit odd. I mean, clearly this kid's head, I hope, was not the size of her parents at that age, but we see her, and the kid's got hold of the chain, but you can see the mother's got probably a little bit better hold of the watch, because we didn't want that getting flung around or dropped if the kid got a little rambunctious. So certainly there's other paintings. This is Joseph Davis. He wasn't identified for a long time. He was called the left-handed artist, but he often created these little vignettes, and the odds are probably 50-50 at best that this family, this Frost family, actually owned a clock. But at that point, you could say, like even some of the other paintings I talked about before, you could throw in props to make the family look more sophisticated, more affluent, more disciplined. So perhaps they had a lovely stenciled clock like this. They may not have. They might not have had colorful floor color tailoring, but Davis was an itinerant painter. He would go town to town, house to house, and paint these little portraits. And he probably offered them the option of hanging a clock in the painting. Often they were banjo clocks, not this type of wall clock that was depicted. This is a better artist, of course. This is a scene, again, in a household portrait, but this is telling a story because this is probably a lower class family, even though they have kind of a primitive tall clock that's on display here. But this is a higher class, upper class woman who is visiting them and handing out religious tracts. So she's bringing them the word as she's perhaps going door to door in the poorer neighborhoods. They're having more fun in this painting. This is called this type of event was called a frolic. There was kind of supervised flirtation and ways for young people to get to know each other under supervision. You see all kinds of people are watching while the couples are dancing. And again, we know that this is a family that had some sophistication and affluence, because again, we see the tall clock hanging in the corner, as well as some nice stenciling along the painted walls. So once in a while, the painting actually includes a clockmaker, and that's the case here. This is John Bailey, Jr. of Hanover, south of Boston, not too far from me, here in Andover, Mass. So this is actually a clockmaker showing him with his clock. This we know as well, folk art painting. We know also that this is a posthumous painting. And you don't have to be Freud or Fellini to figure out, what the message is here of time passing. And we'll see this again of a child holding that watch up to the ear. They don't perhaps necessarily all indicate that this child was not alive any longer at the time of this painting, but I think it's a common kind of metaphor for what's happening here. This is another great one. I love this one. It could just be that they're having fun with this image, and kids probably like to hear the ticking of the clock. There's other more sophisticated ones by Gainsborough, for example, showing grandpa holding the watch up to the kids so they could hear a tick. So, and watches were not that common then, so it was probably especially amusing to young children at the time. I'm going to have a few more photographs later on, but I thought I'd put this in here now. This is actually a very early photograph, but again, with that same depiction of the little tyke having the watch ticking at their ear. In this case, another folk art painting. Luckily, again, the older kids got a pretty good grip on the watch ribbon, while the baby wants to maybe be a little bit too rough on the watch. But these folk art paintings, they're not that common, and I love finding them when I do find them. In fact, right uptown from me in the Andover Historical Society, discovered by accident, they have this miniature by Clarissa Peters, a local artist, although she ended up in Boston, again, showing a mother and child. This may be posthumous because she has a black dress on, but we don't know for sure if that's the case. Then we have another child holding a ribbon. Often you think watches had chains, but quite often less expensive and perhaps easier to grip were these braided ribbons that you see. Those haven't lasted as long as chains, so maybe that's why we've forgotten about them or see chains more commonly. I love this painting too. It's owned by Historic New England, and it's actually at a wonderful exhibit of their artwork that's down in Milton at one of their historic houses. But I love the little girl there sitting on this beautiful, interesting Empire sofa, and you have a banjo clock over here on the side on an interesting wall bracket too, which is unusually the banjo clocks are hanging on the wall. But this is a great wall bracket that's instructive for some of us who collect banjo clocks to see a different type of way that a banjo clock was displayed. This also is one of my favorite. This is at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts too. Clearly, this artist had a little problem with perspective, because I don't think that steeple clock was that big, was that small, or the kid was that big, but we'll leave that as it may. And just amazingly, fortunately, this painting came up for sale and I bought it. And this is a wonderful mother and child, and you see that she's holding a pocket watch. There's a close-up of the image. I own this now, and you can see enough to see that this is a watch, and there's a picture of the painting in my dining room. So I have now very happy to have one of these myself. This is a deathbed scene of George Washington. They're taking his pulse after they essentially bled him to death, trying to cure him of the flu that he caught riding around in the rain. But here the doctor is timing with the pulse. This is a folk art image actually showing the time that George R. Slacks died, not just the date of his death, but showing a pocket watch with one of these ribbons of when he passed away. You'll see more images of women with watches. This is Francisco Goya, a Spanish painting, but suddenly we're back, in America with other paintings, again, with women with big chains, ribbons, watches showing folk art with the watch peeking out of a pocket. Again, watch peeking out of a pocket here too. The fun thing about this is we always think of these as American folk art paintings. This painting I saw in Tasmania, south of Australia, painted by an Australian artist who had never been to America, but painted around the same time as American folk art. So interesting that we weren't the only ones painting women like that, obviously. And this is another that I own. This is actually a portrait miniature of a woman right near me in Lowell, Massachusetts. And you see she has a pocket watch sticking out. I've never seen another miniature with a watch like this. And again, I was very happy to see it at an antique show and be able to buy it. Again, another elaborate headdress watch prominently displayed. German fractors too are often have this imagery of a clock showing time's passage. This is great. This is by Hunt. It's at the Tate Museum in London. This is the awakening conscience. There were people, women who were kept mistresses of these rich guys. And this is showing that she's suddenly awakening to the fact that she's living an immoral life and should do something different with it. This trope has been used occasionally. You can see that Loudon Wainwright used it on a album cover, and this is one of my favorites where somebody decided to use the same imagery but put cats in the picture instead of the man and woman. So this is a little more somber retrospection by an American artist, just ruminating about times gone by with this massive, probably Philadelphia area tall clock in the same room. Edward Lamson Henry depicted Wadsworth's, Henry Longfellow's poem about the clock. And this is his depiction of it. Longfellow apparently said, "You caught the spirit of the poem." This is the poem. There's many more verses, but you may recall the refrain here: forever, never, never, forever, being depicted. We're moving closer to modern times. Cézanne has painted of basically a French black mantle clock, but with no hands, kind of indicating that it doesn't matter what time it is. Clocks can symbolize things without telling you the exact time. This clock actually belonged to his friend Émile Zola. So we know that. There are many wonderful Japanese prints and paintings showing Japanese styles of clocks, which are interesting and different in many ways. Thomas Eakins, one of your Philadelphia artists, chess players, and you see a lovely French figural clock in the background. Winslow Homer, I hoped I would find one of his. He was, of course, an illustrator first before a fine art painter. So you see a Harper's Bazaar New Year's cover with a tall clock. My business name, Belltime Clocks, named after one of his engravings showing Lawrence, Massachusetts, and the bell tower bringing the workers to work and sending them home again. But this was almost an unknown Homer painting called Winding the Clock. It's owned by Texas A&M University. It's interesting in many ways. So usually men wound the clock. Winding the clock at the time was a euphemism for sexual relations. So we're not sure what's going on here. We also see a cello here, which was a controversial instrument for women to play because of the way women would sit to play it. You can see another Homer here showing the way that men would sit with the same way to play the cello. This is a Homer in his studio playing the cello. So one of my favorite presentations at my Horology and Art Symposium was the professor from A&M, art history professor, talking a lot about that painting, and I encourage you all to watch that. This is Jérôme, a French artist, that he married the daughter of a major French art dealer, a good strategic move, and this is his portrait of that woman. This is a card game, American artist with a big wall clock going on there. Another card game, one of my favorites, perhaps not fine art, This is called A Friend in Need. These were done in early 20th century advertising for cigars. And you can see one friend is offering another friend a little help with his poker hand. Vincent van Gogh, sort of a sad scene, but you see his shimmering. He's obviously had a lot of absinthe. This is called the Night Cafe. And when he was staying in the country, he was at this cafe late into the evening. You see a typical French Morbier bakery clock here, and I show a real example of one quite similar that were common commercial clocks of the time. Here we have Child Hassam. He's painting Madison Square Park in New York City, and you see the street clock there. Lo and behold, that street clock is still on the street there, right around the corner from Italy. If you've gone to New York and tried to buy a lot of good Italian food, if you go to Italy and around the corner, you'll see that street clock. Child Hassam did one other I could find. This is a scene of the Thames in London and the bell tower in the distance. I love the little illuminated dial and red hands you can see there. Mauricio Trillo did a clock. Winslow Edward Hopper did several with clocks in them that I enjoy. This is one of my favorites. I did a horology and art feature on this, 7 a.m., probably a storefront in Truro, showing a school clock. Let's see, right now I need to, occasionally I draw a blank on these, but I will tell you, yeah, of course, Matisse, the Red Studio. This is his studio with his French style tall clock in there. And here's another case where I show you that this is actually quite a large painting, almost a walk-in painting that you can see at MoMA in New York. De Chirico too did these great depictions of clocks with trains and all. His father was a railroad engineer, so trains are in the pictures with clocks a lot. And again, you see that this is a rather large painting too there at MoMA as these kids are learning about it from one of the instructors. Diego Rivera painted alarm clock. As you know, he was married tumultuously on and off to Frida Kahlo. And here's Frida Kahlo's self-portrait with an alarm clock. Apparently she was about to be married at 3 o'clock, and this is showing the time's getting close and perhaps she's having second thoughts about marrying Diego. Marc Chagall, he had in his early childhood in Eastern Europe before he left the Jewish settlements there, apparently they had one of these German wall regulators. So here's, they appears in several of his paintings. Here's one. You see another one where his wife is actually swinging along with the pendulum. So that's another Chagall that he had some fun with, I guess. And this is Magritte. And Magritte dealt with the issue of what we name things is rather arbitrary. We've just decided that this is a valise, but it could be called by any other name, the same way that a clock, if the English language had developed in such a way where wind meant clock, then we would all understand that this word went with that image. So it's a fun concept to play with. And of course, we have Magritte as well, with this wonderful image of a time of the locomotive coming out of the fireplace. And Joseph Cornell, who did those great shadow boxes, he played with that concept too in one of his later artworks, showing that too. We have Picasso, he's got a woman with a watch, not many. I was lucky to find one. Grant Wood, who did American Gothic, is showing his doctor's hands. This was about a year before Grant Wood died, and he was seeing his doctor a lot, so he sketched his doctor's hands with the pocket watch. Otto Dix, he would do portraits of his clients in Germany and make them look 10 or 20 or 30 years older than they were. This was a businessman who clearly was not that old, as the story goes, but they're interesting depictions. And of course, Edvard Munch, who did Between the Clock and the Bed. He was in old age deciding whether the clock was still going to drive him to do work or whether he should just lie down and take it easy for the remaining year of his life. And there was a wonderful exhibit at the Met where this painting was the feature painting, but it was an entire entire exhibit of Edvard Munch's work, which was a wonderful exhibit I was able to see. Horace Pippen, an African-American painting. There's a number of his interior domestic scenes where there's a little clock in the picture. This is another African-American artist painted by one of his African-American colleagues. He was actually a janitor in an apartment building, and this was his apartment in the basement with his alarm clock alerting him that he probably needed to get to work. This is Shin, one of the Ashcan painters. This apparently has something to do with electioneering. He's the man for me is the title of this painting. What the alarm clock's hanging around his neck on a chain, I can't explain, but perhaps some of you can imagine. And this is Jacob Lawrence, another African-American artist, actually showing a black watchmaker at work. So in his wonderful way of depicting things. Norman Rockwell certainly threw in a lot of clocks and watches in his paintings. I have several which I love. Here's a iconic watchmaker scene. Here's a young girl getting her first wristwatch from another watchmaker. And this is young Henry Ford. Not everyone knows that Henry Ford, his first passion was clocks and watches. As a teenager, he almost went into business manufacturing watches rather than cars. But this is a later depiction of him with his fathers. He's starting to get very interested in clockwork things and in clocks and watches. Philip Gustin, he often has depictions that look like they're Ku Klux Klan people, and there was a major exhibit of his that was delayed a few years. The book is now out. The exhibit will happen, but with a better interpretation of Philip Gustin's intentions for why he has Klan-looking people in his artworks, and often there are clocks in there as well. Rube Goldberg, I believe, if let's see, no, I'm sorry, this is I have a Goldberg that I think I might have left out afterwards. This is Alexander Calder, better known for his mobiles, but this is a great colorful picture as well. Roy Lichtenstein, so we're getting into op art, getting again more modern. Jasper Johns has painted something with a wristwatch, and again, this is another African-American artist. Kelly James Marshall. This was in a great exhibit of her things at the Met a year or two ago. Jamie Wyeth painted this on the island of Monhegan, where he lived for a while. This was Orca Bates, who was kind of a wild child on the island that he often painted. This is Screen Door by the Sea. You can see the sea in the background. And if you don't know what Jamie Wyeth looks like, he's the third generation of the Wyeth artist dynasty. We were able to hear him speak at the Museum of Fine Arts at an exhibit of his paintings a few years ago. So that's Jamie Wyeth a few years ago anyway. We're going to zip through just a couple of early photographs. Some are fine art, like this very early daguerreotype of a girl with a watch. Matthew Brady took many photographic portraits of famous and not so famous people in his photo studios around the time of the Civil War. This is Clara Barton, who wanted her picture taken. Brady had a clock in the studio, which sitters could decide to be photographed with. And it's called the Reaper model. I happen to own an example of it, but I have people like George Custer and Robert E. Lee appearing in photos by Matthew Brady with the clock in the picture as well. Berenice Abbott took some wonderful photographs early in the mid 20th century. This is a watchmaker, clockmaker's shop. Diane Arbus, there's no odd-looking people in this one, but this is a Levittown, Long Island living room at Christmas time. Stieglitz, if I'm getting, no, I'm sorry, I mixed those guys up. Alfred Eisenstadt, we're almost to the end. This is Penn Station, the famous clock there. And we're also seeing Penn Station by another African-American photographer, Marjorie Collins, around the same time of people waiting to get their tickets. This is Eve Arnold, a famous picture of Malcolm X. We see him here with his wristwatch. I haven't been zoomed in enough to see what kind of watch it was, but it's a great picture of him and his watch. I love this painting too by Eastern European Joseph Kudelka. This is in Prague. And if some of you remember Prague Spring, when Dubček thought that he was freeing Czechoslovakia from the Soviet yoke, and they called another mass meeting at noon in Prague. And you see the hand holding up the watch showing that it's around noon. But unfortunately, on this day, the Soviet tanks rolled in and squashed Prague Spring and the Prague Rebellion and reimposed strict communist rule over the country. So clearly no one has shown up for this mass demonstration. We're almost at the end, and I'm seeing Edward Gorey here reminding me that the time is getting close as he peers upon this column sundial. And finally, I'm taking this opportunity. Here's Thomas Jefferson preparing to work on the Declaration of Independence. I don't think he's setting it on fire. I think he's just trying to read it with an interesting tall case in the background. But I mention this because coming up in October is another symposium that I've organized on timekeeping during the American Revolution. And the public is welcome. I hope that a lot of you who are listening will decide to join us there to hear a lot about it. And one of the iconic scenes that I use to promote the symposium is this Paul Revere engraved image of the Boston Massacre. So you see it, this was a propaganda piece. It didn't happen that way. John Adams defended the British soldiers and when they were tried for shooting down some of the demonstrators. But this is actually a twofer because on the State House, we see a wall-mounted sundial, which was often the more reliable way to tell time during the day when the sun was shining. And we also see a large dial clock on the old brick church behind it. The problem was that Revere rushed this print out and he got the time wrong by 2 hours of the actual event on the clock, and he issued a second state of the print showing the correct time. Again, it was 2 hours differently. And if you happen to find one of these at a yard sale, you should get it. An original of these just sold for $412,000 at a New York auction house. So they're rather rare, and I probably won't be able to ever afford an original. So I'm now posting these websites. This is the symposium that I hope you'll join us at. This is the Horology and Art Symposium, still there with links to the speakers. And this is how you can find me. And as Erica said at the beginning, I'm more than happy if you contact me to send you the list. We perhaps can post it too with the recording, and I can send you images and more information about any of the images that you saw tonight that you would have liked to look at for more than 2.6 seconds as I rushed you through this whirlwind tour of horology and art. So thank you for joining us. Of course, I'm available for chatting and of course, chatting at other times too. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you, Bob. That was great. So we did get a fair number of questions come in as you were giving your presentation, and I know we're running a little long on time, but hopefully folks can sit around, watch as we answer some of the questions. So I think there's a few that are about pocket watches, so I think I'll just kind of combine them together as your first question, if you don't mind. So we got a couple questions about when were pocket watches introduced? What is the difference between a watch and a clock? And were pocket watches as popular with men and women?
Yeah, all good questions. And portable timekeeping was a big advance, probably in the 16th century, when you were able to have mainsprings rather than hanging weights that powered clocks. So you could start making smaller and smaller clocks, and like the ones you saw with the Duchess of Urbino. But eventually, because these people were skilled, they were able to make them actually portable size. Again, terrible timekeepers, but they were status symbols, and you could have them. I think probably men wore them more than women, unless you were particularly affluent. And I have many pictures, again, that when we do part 3, 4, and 5 of this presentation, I can show you of queens and all with watches hanging on them. It's always funny when you see someone hugely affluent with 2 watches hanging, on her and on the front of her dress. Because 2 watches is terrible. You never know which one is right. You need either 1 or 3. And if you have 3, then 2 will be right, and you can know what time it is. 2, it's hopeless. And certainly if you want to talk about Philadelphia in the 18th century, very few women had watches. Some did. We know Franklin's daughter, Sally, had a watch which Franklin obtained for her in London. But But mostly it was men who carried these pocket watches, and supposedly they needed to know what time it was a lot, and they would bother Edward Duffield a lot by going into his shop and asking him what time it was, to the extent that he eventually built and hung a large clock outside of his shop so that they wouldn't keep bothering him and interfering with his clockmaking work inside.
Great, thank you. Another question. How long would the Renaissance clocks run on a single wind?
Uh, it was actually a great achievement to get to one day. Sometimes they were 10, 16 hours. But you have to remember too that if it was a weight-driven clock, it only depended on how high up on the wall you wanted to hang it, because the weights would fall a certain amount every hour or every day, more likely every hour. So if you could get the clock hanging high, like you saw in that Jan Stein painting with the monkey playing around with it, that clock was hanging hanging that high, in part so that the weights would have a long way to descend before they hit the floor, and you had to pull them back up again. So it was an innovation to actually add more gears and to make it so that they would run even a full day and then even a week. And pocket watches were the same way, because they were powered by springs that weren't that strong, weren't that long. So you often needed to wind them more frequently. But back then, everybody understood that. They were used to winding it. It wasn't like now where, you explode when you have to change your quartz battery in your watch every 3 years. Wow, what an imposition. The old days, there was a lot of clock winding and watch winding that took place. Mm-hmm.
And I have a question about clockmakers. Prior to the Rembrandts, you showed a number of Southern European paintings with German clocks. Did German clockmakers predominate in that period?
Yes, and it was really a function of metalworking trades, particularly in cities like Nuremberg and Augsburg in southern Germany. They had mineral resources there. They were the confluence of trade routes, and there were very skilled and strong metallurgy guilds, goldsmiths particularly, and locksmiths, which were really the first watch and clockmakers before they had their own guilds. It was goldsmiths, silversmiths, locksmiths who had the ability to make those. The big tower clocks were often by blacksmiths who could make very large iron gears for those kinds of things as well. So that's really where it started. Although the story is that mechanical timekeeping really originated in northern Italy in monasteries, because some of the orders had extremely strict times when they needed to pray day and night. And during the night, some poor monk was staying up, turning over a sand glass or watching candles burn down that had lines drawn on them. And at some point they got sick of it and said, can't we have some kind of geared machine that will ring a bell every hour or every 4 hours so that we know when to wake up and go pray without having to use these other methods? Obviously a sundial wasn't going to work at night. So we're still in that southern Germany, northern Italy area that they believe was the origin of mechanical timepieces.
And another question about introduction of types of clocks. When were long cases introduced?
Well, we saw those early depictions, such as the really historically incorrect one of St. Augustine, or St. Augustine, I never know how to say that. But the problem was that those were originally called wag on the wall clocks, like we saw with the monkey too, where there's a clock up on the wall, pendulums hanging down, swinging in the air, the weights are hanging down, swinging, and those were easy targets for little kids and cats and everything to go grab, and all that dust and soot from those environments with smoky fireplaces and dusty streets and all. So it really was kind of an innovation to say, why the heck don't we put this inside of a piece of furniture so that, these things aren't going to get attacked by cats and kids, and some of the dust is protected. So it really was 1600s in England where you see the development of long case clocks. And originally they had movements in them that only had short pendulums that swung up in the top. But once you had the invention of the pendulum and the long pendulum that was actually a meter long and ticked seconds, at that point, you really could enclose everything with a pendulum inside this long, narrow case that didn't have to swing very wide and could tick away the seconds, protected from the elements and the kids and cats.
And now I have a question about clocks, the symbolic meanings that they have. In many of the paintings, the clocks are decorations or indication of status. Those we saw where a timepiece is symbolic. It tells us that life is short. Are there pictures in which clocks are given other symbolic meanings?
Um, Certainly mortality is the key one, but um, often too, as we talked about in the American scenes and even with the Duchess of Urbino, showing that these people had money. Because especially at those earlier times, and even in colonial America, you did not own a clock unless you were rich or close to rich. So I think, I don't think the clocks in those genre American scenes were screaming out that, you know, you're going to die and go to hell and you better be, you better take care of yourself now. I think they were instead uh, announcing the fact that this family had enough money to afford one.
Great. So I have a comment and a question. Great presentation. I love seeing the diverse ways in which artists and figures, primarily in Western societies, perceived and interacted with time. Do you have plans to publish a catalog dedicated to horology and art?
Um, yes, I hope to. And in fact, I had hoped to do a book after the symposium. But the nightmare problem, as everybody who does a picture book discovers, is getting their permissions to use the images. So it's a long range project, but I'm basically channeling this guy named Alfred Chapuis, who is long dead. He was a Swiss collector, scholar of horology. And in 1954, he produced a book, black and white in French, on this subject. Nobody's done one since. And it's time to do a horology and art book. Whether I'm the right guy to do it, since I'm not an art historian, but I'd love to do it. I'd love to assemble the type of art historians that I invited to speak at my symposium and to do something like this, because you know, there's so much of this eye candy, and maybe at some point I have to bite the bullet and say I'll tough out the permissions and we'll create a beautiful book that I hope 300 people will buy, and and I'll have one and feel like until the next Chapuis and Frishman comes along a century from now, there'll be another book on the subject.
Great, thank you. I have one final question, and actually, I was going to kind of tag on maybe a question for myself, but hopefully it won't take too long. It's when were the first 8-day clocks made? And I was just also curious if you've done any work, kind of thinking about the art on clocks, because several of the clocks that you showed is sort of showing the original of what was shown in the painting, and there's just lovely art on those clocks themselves. So.
Yes, yeah, that's the flip side. But the first question first about 8-day clocks, that really, again, I would say probably was England in the 1600s, because there was, you know, a great advantage to having a clock. You only had to wind 8 days, and there are actually longer duration clocks that would run 2 weeks, a month, a year even. They had much heavier weights, more gears, because every time you add another step in duration, you need more gears. And when you have more gears, you have more friction. So everything has to work better, or else the clock doesn't work very well at all if you start adding more wheels, more complications. So, but I'd say by the beginning of the 18th century, 8-day clocks were available, and they were the clocks of choice if you could afford one. Now I've forgotten the other half of your question.
Oh, it was about art on clocks.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, yeah, and that's something where people often too say, oh, you're talking about like reverse paintings on steeple clock glasses, things like that. Yeah, there's a lot of art on clocks. I was about to say great art on clocks, but that would be a lie. I don't know of much good art on clocks at all. But unless you actually talk about engraving skills on dials, which some of that engraving is beautiful. If you talk about painted moon phase dials, you know, where some of the pictures of the man on the moon are pretty darn good. Some of those reverse paintings are actually pretty good. Most were painted, you know, as fast as they could by women that got, you know, 2 cents each to do them in early Connecticut for those mass-produced clocks. But certainly Japan or chinoiserie clocks with beautiful lacquered imagery surfaces on them are, you could almost call them fine art by themselves too. So, but that's another thing. There's actually, you know, a number of clock type people who focus on horology on art. I mean, art on horology, not horology in art. It's another field. I certainly admire it, but as far as I know, Rembrandt never painted a clock case or a dial. So I'm sticking with the guys that knew how to paint.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, well, this was wonderful. Thank you so much. So I think I'll bring the evening to a close. Thank you so much for those of you it's stuck. Well, I shouldn't say stuck around. This is great. So I appreciate you taking the time flew by. So it's a little bit later than 8 o'clock. So I want to just wish everyone a great evening. And again, thank you, Bob, so much for this great presentation. I think we all learned a lot. God, who knew so much? Well, you knew how many clocks were in fine art, and I look forward to your further work on working with our kind of popular art materials in the library company, and seeing how many clocks and watches you come up with our materials that we haven't spotted in the what did you say, spot the clock in your work. So
Yeah.
again, everyone, have a great evening, and thank you so much, Bob, and I hope you have a great evening and a great weekend. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Yep.
Okay.